Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. CSRC and BioTel Research present Remote Cardiac Safety Monitoring for Clinical Trials, Pandemic and Beyond. My name is Sarah and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank BioTel Research, who helped develop the content for this presentation. BioTel is a pioneering core lab for clinical trials, an innovative medical device company, and a leading healthcare services organization. With these unique competencies, they have built their research expertise working with sponsors, CROs, and sites, conducting more than 2,000 clinical trials. They offer a complete suite of services to support all major areas of drug and device research and support all major cardiovascular testing modalities for clinical trials. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event, Dr. Fred Senatore, Lieutenant Stephen Browning, Dr. Kenneth Stein, Dr. Electra Papadopoulos, Dr. Polina Velashko, and Dr. Kenneth G. Faulkner. And Dr. Jonathan Seltzer will act as our moderator for today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Dr. Seltzer. You may start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to all of our listeners. I'm Jonathan Seltzer, the Executive Director of the Cardiac Safety Research Consortium and CSO of WCG Clinical. Today's CSRC webinar, Remote Monitoring of Cardiac Safety, Practical and Regulatory Issues, is the latest topic in the CSRC's examination of the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on cardiovascular issues in clinical trials. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with the Cardiac Safety Research Consortium, the CSRC is a collaboration with industry, academia, and the regulatory agencies. This multi-stakeholder group of cardiac safety experts provides guidance for regulators and clinical trialists on pre-competitive cardiac safety issues for both new and existing medical products. Next slide, please. Since 2006, the CSRC, through think tanks, projects, and peer-reviewed publications, has contributed to regulatory thinking and clinical trial practice. For example, recent efforts have defined best practices for evaluation of cardiac issues in shock, the novel or direct oral anticoagulants, and cardio-oncology. And just this week, I'm pleased to say, in collaboration with industry, academic, and community partners, the CSRC announced establishment of a national database of pediatric cardiac screening information. If you're interested in learning more about CSRC or becoming a member, please view our website at cardiac-safety.org or contact us directly at info@cardiacsafety.org. Next slide, please. Over the past several years, the advent of digital technologies made possible new clinical trials models, variably known as virtual, remote, or decentralized clinical trials. Due to potential efficiencies, the mode gained great interest from private and public sources. Over the past couple years, it has gained public attention from the National Academy of Sciences, as well as garnering significant investment from the private sector. This slow-growing trend now seems to be accelerated by the pandemic. The FDA, in their COVID-19 guidances, encourage remote monitoring when on-site monitoring is not possible. Next slide, please. Additionally, our European regulatory colleagues released a guidance also encouraging remote monitoring. Next slide, please. This guidance did not go unheeded or unnoticed. As you can see, the popular press, next slide, please, as well as the scientific press has noted this trend both concluding that the trend of remote clinical trials may be here to stay. Next slide. That said, there remain issues surrounding regulatory acceptance of data derived from remote clinical trials. For instance, how do we judge the integrity of data captured remotely? How do we know if the technology gathering the data itself is valid? How can we be sure that remote monitoring can actually detect adverse events? Very importantly, can we keep patients safe solely with remote visits? And finally, what remote endpoints will regulators accept? Next slide, please. Our program today will discuss these questions and perhaps raise some others. This CSRC webinar will present a balance between those who gather data remotely and those who evaluate it. We'll get an insider look at actual remote data, learn about the nuances of real-world experiences in capturing cardiac monitoring data and clinical outcome assessments, as well as hear from FDA divisions of drug devices and clinical outcome assessment about acceptability and integrity. With many, many thanks to our experts who diligently prepared for this webinar, I'll now turn the program over to our first speaker, Dr. Ken Stein.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jonathan, and thank you for the invitation to speak. My goal here is really to set the stage for the rest of the talks by presenting some preliminary and I hope provocative examples of what we've been able to glean from remote physiologic monitoring early on in the pandemic. If we go to the next slide, just to remind everyone, I am an employee and shareholder in Boston Scientific. I will be discussing some off-label uses of the remote monitoring capability of our devices. And probably most importantly, the data that I'm going to present with respect to what we've found during COVID has been submitted for publication, but is not yet published. And everything I'm about to tell you that reflects on COVID should please be considered to be highly preliminary and hypothesis generating at best. If we go to the next slide, what I intend to do over the next few minutes is first, for the people who are not familiar with it, review the remote heart failure physiologic monitoring capabilities that we have within the Boston Scientific devices that fall under the general rubric of what we call HeartLogic, and then give some case examples of what we are seeing both in terms of population level insights during the pandemic, as well as some patient level case studies through COVID-19. If we go to the next slide, first, again, just to baseline everyone on the sorts of data that we are able to telemeter out from our implanted devices. And it depends a bit on the device, but in our most recent generation of implantable cardiac defibrillators and cardiac resynchronization therapy devices, there's a suite of physiologic parameters that get telemetered out onto the cloud on a daily basis. And these include heart sounds, both S3 amplitude and S1 amplitude. And S3 amplitude, for those of you who don't remember the days of phonocardiography, is a relatively good correlate of left ventricular end diastolic pressure. S1 amplitude is a bit more complicated, but for most purposes can be seen as a load-dependent measure of contractility. We can also measure respiration, both in terms of rate and respiratory patterns. Transthoracic impedance, which is a measure of thoracic fluid accumulation. And again, just to baseline those of you who don't follow this routinely, thoracic impedance goes down as pulmonary edema fluid or other electrically active fluids accumulate in the lungs. We can measure sleep incline, that's a measure of orthopnea, activity level, as well as we've done for many years, data on heart rate and arrhythmias. And if we go to the next slide, in addition to reporting out these individual sensors, we developed in a nearly 1,000 patient prospective clinical trial called MultiSense, an index that algorithmically calculates, based on all of these sensors, what's called the HeartLogic Index, and have shown that at a nominal setting of 16, that index has a sensitivity of 70% for predicting impending heart failure decompensations, heart failure hospitalizations, with an unexplained alert rate of 1.5 alerts per patient year, and with the alerts preceding the event by a median of just over a month, 34 days. So if we go to the next slide, let me show you just sort of some of the insights that we've been able to start gleaning by looking at these kinds of remote physiologic parameters in real world patients during the pandemic. And again, reiterate that these data are unpublished at this point and are preliminary at best. First thing I want to show, if we go to the next slide, is to just look at the population level of all of the patients with our devices on remote monitoring in a given metro area. And what we've shown on the left is all the patients in the New York City metro area. On the right, the patients in the Minneapolis. And 2019 is sort of that lighter blue dotted line. 2020 is that dark blue solid line. And what I've shown here is just very simply activity based on an accelerometer within the implanted device. And this we can glean from almost all of our pacemakers as well as defibrillators and CRT devices. And what you note is if you look at that solid dotted line is the date of the emergency order with respect to COVID-19. And then the shaded areas are the time of lockdown within each of these geographies. And so what you see, both in New York City and Minneapolis, first off, people started modifying their activity level substantially with the emergency declaration and well ahead of any official lockdown orders. Likewise, you can see that people started resuming levels of activity, although they never got back up to normal, well before the end of lockdown. And clearly, this raises issues we have to think about in our trials in terms of endpoints of trials for heart failure patients who may have had substantially different activity levels over the course of the pandemic, even if they didn't catch COVID. It also, I think, shows this that at least in these two metro areas, the lockdown orders and lifting the lockdown, I think, followed the behavior of the citizenry rather than led the behavior of the citizenry. If we go to the next slide, just out of interest, showing a different parameter, this is heart rate variability, again, in the overall population with our devices. Heart rate variability, of course, is a marker of sympathovagal balance. The lower heart rate variability associated with sympathetic excess. And here, and I can't explain why, see a very different pattern in New York City than you did in the Twin Cities during the lockdown, perhaps just reflecting a greater societal concern given the larger impact of COVID in New York City during this time period. Or it may just be that New Yorkers are much less equanimity in response to stress than do Minnesotans. If we go to the next slide, I'll turn now to show just some 3 case studies of patients with our devices who happened to have a COVID diagnosis and we're able to follow what happened to their physiology through the diagnosis of COVID. In the interest of time, we've got many more than 3 at this point, but I'm going to limit myself to these 3. They are reasonably representative of what we're seeing overall. The next slide, and I'll orient you to what I'm showing. So on the right, these are the various physiologic parameters that we're capable of telemetering out from our devices now. I'll caution you, one of them that we're showing here, temperature, is not core body temperature. It's temperature of the device itself. We use it to calculate battery longevity in the devices, and that is not available to clinicians right now. That's just available to us from a research standpoint. At any rate, what you see here is a patient whose various physiologic parameters were quite stable up until mid-March. And there you can see a number of the different parameters start to trend up, particularly respiratory rate, which is the second one down from the top, followed by what we call the rapid shallow breathing index. It's a respiratory pattern associated with panting. Nocturnal heart rate goes up, the S1 heart sound goes up, and temperature starts to go up, activity goes down, thoracic impedance goes up. And some of these changes actually precede the onset of overt symptoms from the patient, which began on March 13th. March 16th, patient actually was COVID positive. On the 17th, our heart logic alert went off. And I think what's interesting here, some of these changes are the sorts of changes you can also see in heart failure, but some are quite distinctly different. And in particular, the increase in thoracic impedance and the increase in S1 amplitude are unusual in heart failure. And actually, the thoracic impedance is the opposite of what you'd expect to see both with heart failure or with a bronchial pneumonia. If we go to the next slide, second case, and what to show you here again, this is a patient who had a heart failure episode and went into alert on heart logic in April, responded to titration of oral diuretics. And so you can see the heart logic index come back down to normal. But subsequent to that, developed, I guess, hard to say classic at this point for a disease as new as COVID, but typical COVID symptoms, including anosmia. And in this case, went actually a week and a half before getting a positive COVID test. But by the time of the positive COVID test, again, a clear increase, a dramatic increase in respirations, increase in nocturnal heart rate, again, an increase in the S1 heart sound, and again, this very atypical increase in transthoracic impedance. And if we go to the last case on the next slide, again, what you're going to see is, again, quite similar. This is a patient who was initially asymptomatic and actually just had a positive screening test for COVID when they were transferred to a long-term care facility. Was asymptomatic at that point, but again, if you look at the physiologic data, you can see that there were already clear physiologic changes associated with this pre-symptomatic status, increased respiratory rate, increase in this rapid shallow breathing index, increase in the nocturnal heart rate, and again, this very atypical increase in transthoracic impedance that actually in this case all preceded the development of symptoms. And so if we go to the next slide, I think the summary in terms of COVID is that we do see clear and often dramatic changes in the physiologic sensors associated with the diagnosis of COVID-19. They're actually much larger than what we typically see in heart failure patients. And a few of the changes, and particularly the change in thoracic impedance, is very different from what's seen in heart failure, and also very different from what's typically seen in bronchial pneumonia. And we're speculating at this point as to whether this is specific for COVID pneumonitis or whether this actually is something that's going to turn out to be typical of any type of interstitial pneumonitis. So again, I want to point out maybe one more time, these are all very preliminary findings and need to be validated with further study, but they do at least illustrate the potential power of getting this type of routine, remote, real-world physiologic data from patients in general, and particularly through the pandemic. Thank you for the attention, and let me turn things over to the next speaker.
Good afternoon. This is Fred Senatori. I'm a medical officer with the Food and Drug Administration. And the content of my talk is what type of data would we accept for a regulatory approval? Next slide, please. I must say that the content of and the opinions expressed in this presentation are my personal views and do not reflect positions or policies of the FDA. Next slide, please. Well, in order to understand what remote data means, I offer here a definition of what type of remote data we might entertain for a regulatory review. We define remote data as data that may be electronically transmitted from the subject's home to a database repository. And some of the examples I have here is like heart rate with an Apple Watch or blood pressure with an automated blood pressure monitoring device, rhythm such as a Holter, patient-related outcome via a visual analog scale. Patients will say how they feel, function, and survive from a laptop or a tablet where the data is automatically transmitted to a website for data accumulation. Exercise capacity, such as a makeshift 6-minute walk distance at their home or actigraphy, and any adverse event solicitation via a remote visit. Next slide, please. From the regulatory perspective, there are two key things that are important, and if there's a take-home message, it's this slide. Elements of remote data that facilitate meeting the evidentiary standard for a substantive review are must have a well-defined variability of the acquired data with selected home monitoring equipment, and also the remote data must measure and distinguish a clinically meaningful treatment effect. So the variability and a strategy capable of distinguishing a clinically meaningful treatment effect. That would be the take-home message from this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, what are some of the challenges from a regulatory perspective? There are three, and two are on this slide. The first is the clinical meaning of what is measured. Now, actigraphy, for example, measures gross motor activity and rest motion cycles. It is not a 6-minute walking distance. So how are data interpreted? The second issue, which is pertinent to the COVID problem that we have, is when an ongoing clinical trial has not finished and patients cannot go to the clinic anymore because of the risk of COVID transmission. A proposal to substitute actigraphy for a 6-minute walking distance in a protocol amendment as a pandemic precaution creates the potential for pooling two non-combinable outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, the third of three challenges would be operational threats to the assessment of pivotal trial adequacy. This is not really a direct problem with the FDA, but it's a problem for the sponsor who's conducting a trial because of the data that will accrue and subsequently be submitted to the FDA. The subject has to be in possession of the requisite equipment. There has to be adequate knowledge of their use. There has to be compliance with the protocol. These things that are threats to the operational adequacy of the trial will impact the approvability of the drug. And next slide, please. So in summary, remote data capture, we see it as a viable strategy for pivotal trials with endpoints emanating from non-office visits, such as exercise capacity, patient-related outcome, or hemodynamics. The variability of measures should be well-defined, and the results should be able to produce a clinically meaningful and treatment effect. And finally, challenges impacting quality of evidence are undefined variability, protocol amendments resulting in measurement of different efficacy variables, and operational threats to the assessment of trial adequacy. And that concludes my presentation, and we could entertain questions now or later, but I'll defer to the next speaker. So I'd like to introduce Lieutenant Stephen Browning.
Great. Thank you all. My name is Lieutenant Stephen Browning. I'm an Assistant Division Director in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I've been working in cardiac monitoring and diagnostics for about 8 years now. And so I'm just going to give a brief overview of sort of what we would consider when we're looking at different monitoring technologies. Before I move into the presentation, I think one thing that is sort of key to remember as we go through this is that almost every monitoring situation, sort of which trial you're in, what technology you're using, what you're trying to use it for, are unique. And so I tried to develop these slides first as sort of a roadmap, and as I moved through it a couple times, there just was no way to make a one-size-fits-all. So I'm going to try to give you guys a bit of just an overview of the types of things that we're thinking about on the devices side for these monitoring technologies, and sort of let you guys use those tools to better develop your trials in remote monitoring. Next slide, please. So there are sort of 4 categories that I think of when we're talking about cardiac monitoring technologies. There's your standard physiologic parameters, blood pressure, heart rate, pulse oximetry, something that's really just trying to reflect a state of the body and a specific measurement that's taught in most medical schools. There's another types of devices that you could imagine, which are some of the ones that Dr. Sanatorio was just talking about, which are actually trying to reproduce or mimic a typical trial endpoint that we're used to, like 6-minute hall walk. And there's third, some devices that you'll see, a lot of these are sort of worked into the electronic health record, but clinical decision support tools. So based on all the data that the EHR has available to it, are they making recommendations for medication changes or other things that they're thinking they're seeing changes in the remote monitoring that require changes. And the fourth would be sort of what I would call novel clinical diagnostic indices, measurements, or predictors. As Dr. Stein talked about on a lot of their Boston Scientific devices, there's this heart logic. It's calculated from a bunch of different inputs. Another thing that you could think of is a device that measures AF burden or tries to do something more specific than you're in AF now or you're not in AF. And so those tend to be a little more complex and require sort of their own validation and own thinking for how valid the evidence is. So those are basically the 4 types. If you go to the next slide, please. And so then the other thing that you really want to think about is what is the regulatory status of your of the device that you have. So does that device have independent FDA approval or clearance? HeartLogic is approved to be on many of Boston Scientific's devices. There are many, remote blood pressure monitors and pulse oximeters out there. And one thing that's really critical to think about when you're talking about does it have independent FDA approval is, even if it does have independent FDA approval, are you using it in a way that it's labeled? And so, if HeartLogic is approved for a very specific thing, are we using it for the same thing, or do we have to consider this different use case and make sure that there's no additional validation or additional considerations that are necessary? Also being very, very careful of what measurement is coming off the device is actually physiologically relevant. So Dr. Stein had a great point. It doesn't sound like that temperature measurement is available to clinicians, but if they did make temperature of the device available, that may not be directly correlated to core temperature. So you really have to know exactly what each device is measuring. Another way that you could get one of these devices into your trials is not through independent FDA approval, but actually approved under the investigational new drug or investigational device exemption, and actually do it as part of the trial for some of those novel indices, or even for a parameter measurement. We're going to want to see, if it's not been FDA approved or cleared in the past, we're going to want to see validation data for that device under the trial so that we know that the information is going to be accurate. So I've had a number of companies come to me and say, we have this this watch company. We've been working with them for a long time. These are the parameters we think we can get off of the watch. We think they'll be great for our trial. We ask what's their FDA regulatory status, and they basically have none. So we have no clue how accurate it is, and they basically have to submit a whole 510K worth of evidence in the investigational device exemption request. There's another program for, let's say we were developing a 6-minute hall walk test that we thought could be used in multiple different trials, called Medical Device Development Tool Certification. So if you thought you had one of those and you got that MDVT approved, then it would sort of be blessed from the Center for Devices and Radiological Health for use in many heart failure trials. So that's another way that we could use to standardize the space. And there's a number of sort of statutory exemptions for clinical decision support, which is in the 21st Century Cures. There's a FDA guidance on wellness claims, and an FDA guidance on medical device data systems. So I think one key thing to remember, like a key example here, is that the Apple Watch will now give you a pulse oximetry. That is not FDA cleared. That's a wellness claim. So just because a device can give you a number doesn't mean that it's been validated to sort of a clinical level of accuracy. So I put all these on here. There's sort of many ways that a device could be available to you, and that they could have a pretty wide gamut of FDA validation and clinical accuracy, depending on how they got themselves on the market. So as I started, there's a ton of these technologies out there. They're growing exponentially. And so for your particular remote monitoring trial, what you're trying to measure, I think you just really have to trace through what are you measuring, what's its status, and what additional validation are you going to need to make it that valid clinical evidence that Dr. Senatore was talking about. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Volosco.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paulina Volosco, Chief Medical Officer from Biotel Research, and my topic today is practical consideration of remote cardiac monitoring in clinical trials. I would like to begin on my first slide, please begin by saying that obviously digital technologies are transforming the practice of medicine in general, and especially the field of electrophysiology. And COVID-19 pandemic is definitely triggered even more interest and trend moving into the remote direction in terms of clinical trials conduct. There are many actually solutions, and obviously they present great opportunities, but also quite great list of challenges for the companies who are basically considering running those decentralized trials and doing quite some work in remote home-based environments. My next slide, please. So those challenges, that's something that what we really need to think about because of lack of extensive experience that scientific community admits right now. How to determine whether clinical measurements are real candidates for remote collection. What is the list of basic requirements for remote monitoring? How do we select the appropriate class of remote monitors based on their functions? What drug device development company in particular looking for in terms of their specific requirements and potential endpoints? Are those functionalities available currently or maybe even not yet? How to specific remote mobile device to be selected? What are the regulatory implications of moving certain assessment to a remote mode? What type of validation need to be conducted? All those questions absolutely necessary to keep in your mind when you begin decision-making process about the selection of the device for your next upcoming trial. On my next slide, I just would like to, as simple as possible, to kind of like summarize the identify requirements as the part of your thought process. The first question you need to ask yourself, what are we looking for and what are we are concerned about? What really are specific requirements for our study? Is it arrhythmia? Is it sinus pauses, ischemia, other arrhythmic or conduction or ischemia disorders? Do we need full disclosure? Do we need just event reporting? How soon do we need the data? Do we look at something that is absolutely necessary immediately, almost real time, or we'd rather collect data continuously and provide, make sure that it's thoroughly analyzed retrospectively after it has all been downloaded? What data points we are interested in? So there are, as you can see, many questions you need to begin answering even before you decide what kind of device is the preferable device for your specific study. My next slide shows you this actually clinical trial decision pathway just from the clinician point of view, more based on the time, on the endpoints and specific clinical events you would like to address in your study. It's certainly a busy slide, and it actually represents how difficult the process is to select among the functional classes of the devices that are available right now. The next slide is similarly showing you the same clinical trials decision pathway, more from the operational point of view. That is as difficult as the clinical point of view. Are you going to be required full disclosure? Is asymptomatic event capture required? Are you looking at the cable-based, electrode-based type of the device, or you would rather go with something type of the patch device? Is your device registered globally? Is it wireless? How long is the battery? How much memory you can have in your device? So all those questions you really need to kind of like massage internally with your team before you will come up with a conclusion what device to be selected. At this point, my recommendation based on our experience would be you may want to contact one of experts in remote cardiac monitoring because the number of those devices is going up and there is a really serious challenge right there. On my next slide, I am just showing you really the trend we're seeing absolutely obviously, beginning from the Holter monitor that was available, as we know, for many, many decades, and where we are at right now, going through non-loop memory recordings, looping memory recordings, implantable loop recorders, and now basically in the era of cardiac mobile outpatient telemetry or real-time monitoring and patch technology. So briefly on my next slide, explaining what each of those classes might provide you with. The first class I would like to briefly introduce to you is just mobile cardiac telemetry. It is available either as a patch or lead wired devices right now. The major point is you can have it done up to 14 days on the same battery, and you can definitely change it and continue going if you need to have a longer period of time, up to 30 days or even more. It's 24/7, 365 reporting cycle, and real-time reporting and alert reporting is the key element of this functional class. So that's what you will select if you really focused on patient safety and real-time reporting. The next slide, the next functional class, is different. It's also available in patch technology, which is a great technology that's kind of becoming more of the gold standard of running clinical cardiac monitoring in clinical trials. It's also available for 14 days on the same battery. It collects the data as any other Holter that is being digitally downloaded later on and then retrospectively analyzed by the appropriate team of qualified Holter readers or cardiologists or electrophysiologists. I have to say that the patient compliance is absolutely great comparing with the traditional Holter type of the devices. The next class is the class, on my next slide please, is the class of cardiac event monitoring. This is clearly the event monitoring that has been around for a long time. What we're seeing right now is much better devices that are available to obtain this data simple way with no need to going through the live phone-based conversation between patient who is irritated by the episode and still has to talk to technician. So it's being acquired just by placing your device against the chest or by placing fingers on little bar and transferring the data pretty much real time. And it's also being available up to 5 minutes continuous recording and 24/7, 365 reporting cycle, and the alert reporting momentarily as soon as the event is identified is available. And my next slide is probably the most provocative statement I would like to make. It's a new class of devices, functional class. We're talking about wearables that becoming more and more, gain more and more interest. We're talking about all sorts of watches, bracelets, shirts, earpieces, even mattresses. We are seeing all sorts of devices that are being tested right now. And overall evidence favors the use of wearables absolutely. And I believe, and we believe, that the future is very promising, that we need to take it very seriously in terms of what are you trying to accomplish in your during your clinical study. If this device is going to fit well, are you going to get clinical evaluations and statistics that are acceptable and meaningful actually for you to make sure that you have a full picture of cardiac monitoring of your drug or your device? As Heart Rhythm Society mentioned in their most recent articles, false positive associated with the use of wearables to detect arrhythmias can cause unwarranted concerns and screenings. That's the status as of now. There is definitely lots of progress accomplished in there, and we are absolutely looking forward to more progress in this functional group. On my next slide, just to summarize what I was talking about, is to say that obviously utilizing more continuous extended EKG monitoring is the current trend, and the interest in high throughput and rich data is absolutely obvious. Expanding continuous monitoring throughout all phases of clinical drug and device development, including post-marketing, that's another trend we're seeing, and finding the best technology to monitor arrhythmia longer, but making sure that there is a real-time access to the data. All of those trends are real, and we believe that continuous remote EKG monitoring is becoming a cardiovascular safety imperative. Thank you, and I would like to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you so much. This is Electra Papadopoulos, and I am the Acting Director for the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessments in the Center for Drugs at FDA. And I first wanted to thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this virtual session. Next. And these are my own opinions and don't necessarily represent an official FDA position. Next. I'd like to just start with some basic terminology, highlighting what we're trying to do with clinical outcome assessments and why they're important. Essentially, a clinical outcome assessment, or COA, is used to assess clinical benefit in trials and can also be used to assess safety. It is any outcome that describes or reflects how an individual feels, functions, or survives. So COAs are critically important in benefit and risk evaluation and in regulatory decision-making. Next. COAs can be reported by patients, clinicians, non-clinician observers, such as parents or caregivers, and they can be task-based, such as a test of walking speed or memory. We're also increasingly seeing interest in digital health technologies for assessing clinical outcomes of interest, such as sleep or mobility. Next. Now, there's broad recognition that digital health technology is central to the larger effort to modernize clinical trials, and its use can enable greater patient centricity in clinical trials. In fact, we're working across medical product centers in collaboration with stakeholders to facilitate development of fit-for-purpose and innovative endpoint measures. Next. So what is a digital health technology tool? It can be thought of as an electronic technology tool, its scores, and the interpretation of its scores that are intended for use in clinical investigations. They include, but are not limited to, wearables, implantable or ingestible sensors, and stationary sensors such as home motion sensors to detect falls. They can capture data actively or passively, as shown on this slide. Next. So why do we use digital health technology tools? There are a variety of benefits. First and foremost is that they can enable decentralization of clinical trials, resulting in fewer barriers to trial participation, for example, travel. They can enable larger, more inclusive, and more generalizable trials and evidence generation, enhance endpoints that matter to patients in their daily lives, and can provide the ability to collect data from patients who can't report for themselves, such as scratching in infants with atopic dermatitis. We can detect intermittent or rare events, and they can also provide new opportunities to capture entirely new measures, such as behavior patterns in patients with depression. Next. So in terms of evidentiary requirements for digital health technology-based endpoints, I'll broadly say that the evidentiary requirements are no different from other types of outcome measures in that these endpoints need to be well-defined and reliable and fit for purpose. So we ask, does the endpoint score represent something meaningful? And how much change in the endpoint is meaningful to a patient? And last but not least, feasibility and usability are critical to consider. Next. Now, there are a growing number of novel clinical outcome assessments relying on digital health technologies that are in development under CDER's Drug Development Tool Qualification Program. And I won't go through them all, but you can see they include activity monitors, as well as some performance outcome assessments, and even a scratch sensor for use in atopic dermatitis patients. Next. So as we've been talking about today, one of the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic is that it's encouraged us to really embrace new ways of doing things, including greater interest in remote assessment. And it's my belief that this way of thinking is here to stay. So this just highlights the FDA guidance titled Conduct of Clinical Trials During the COVID-19 Public Health Emergency, where we give advice to sponsors, particularly in question 13 of this guidance, on what they should be thinking about when deciding to change their clinical trial protocol to include remote assessments. So first off, how do we think about whether and how patient assessments can still support robust study conclusions? Another is feasibility. We know certain assessments need to be done in person, such as some physical examination assessments. But then if we do move to remote assessments, how can we best advise sponsors to conduct those to preserve fidelity and minimize variability? And this is where we really wanted to emphasize the need for training for both investigators and patients. The guidance also calls for providing the appropriate technology, including tech support, and as well as emphasizing the importance of documenting how an assessment was performed. Was it performed remotely or in clinic, when and where? And all of this is needed to provide important context when analyzing the results. Next slide. And next, I'd just like to close with a couple of forthcoming guidances related to this topic. One is on decentralized clinical trials, and the second is on digital health technologies for remote data acquisition. And these are distinct but related guidances I think will be of great interest. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ken Faulkner. I am the Vice President of ECOA Scientific Services at ERT. We're a clinical trial technology company. Next slide. And just wanted to give you some practical considerations that we found. At the time of the declaration of the public health emergency, our company was supporting in the clinical outcome assessment area just over 500 clinical studies that had to be quickly adapted to the public health emergency. And wanted to thank the people on the FDA, and especially those on the phone, who gave us some really good guidance very quickly about this. But one of the first things that we noticed is there's really three categories that we've had to consider in looking at the different types of visits. And I define those here just because I think they are important for us to consider. Virtual, as I define it, is performed at a distance through technology. So there's no face-to-face interaction here. The remote, as we call it here, we have narrowed that down to be when it might be a home health visit, for example. You might have somebody coming to your house for a face-to-face interaction, but not having someone go into the research clinic. And then the clinic would be, of course, the face-to-face at a research clinic. So when I use the term, just to understand that here. Next. So I believe this is the third time you've seen a picture of the guidance that addresses the public health emergency, and how we go about dealing with clinical trial conduct. If you have not gotten the message, you should be reading this. State the primary goals are patient safety and privacy. I absolutely agree with those. And the focus on quality and integrity of the data. You've heard that from the previous speakers. And also mentioned the importance of training, because we are now asking people to do clinical trials in a different way than they were. So having the right training and the right tools available. So let me go through a few of those. Next slide. You saw some of this from Dr. Papadopoulos, the different outcomes that we have here, but there are some challenges that we look at when we go virtual. So now I'm speaking about the virtual application. The patient-reported outcomes, I think, are a bit easier to do in most cases. Sometimes there are devices which are required at home, but there are issues that we have to be careful to preserve if we're looking in a virtual setting. They don't train virtual interview mode at medical school, at least I don't think they do. So, you know, asking questions in a virtual setting is different than when you have someone across from you. It's just something like verifying the identity of people that are on both sides and guaranteeing privacy. Are you in a place that you can privately talk about the things you've got here on both sides of the equation? And maybe there's a caregiver who needs to be involved when we're doing this for someone who might not be able to complete these on their own. On the clinician-reported outcomes, these are ones where the clinician is observing some kind of behavior, and this will typically require a video interaction. It's not something you can only gauge over the phone to get the visual assessment. And it's true, some assessments just may not be practical or possible. We saw earlier the example from a few of the 6-minute walking distance or 6-minute walk tests. The conditions for doing that are very prescribed in the test, and it may just not be possible to do it in a way that is consistent. And in addition, from a safety standpoint, having sight people close by for some of these assessments may be important. Some of the performance outcomes, difficult to observe, and those might be even more difficult to do when you're looking at things like cognitive assessments and performance assessments in that way too, and need for special equipment. So the different ones have different challenges associated with them, which we've had to look at. Next slide. There's also the whole slew of laboratory procedures and tests which are being done. We heard a lot about cardiac safety and ECG. There was a question, I think, about how do we compare the at-home assessments with ones that might be done in a clinic, because very often you're in the clinic, you might be doing a 12-lead ECG, and then you find that when you have an at-home assessment, it's more along the lines of 6-lead. How do those compare? What do we do? But you already heard about that. You know, laboratory tests, I think sample collection, if you have to do blood samples, it's possible for that to be done in my parlance and remotely, where you could have potentially someone go to a remote site or a remote laboratory testing facility, or have a home health nurse come and get the samples. We haven't really talked much about other things like respiratory function. That's also something which you see it, give a picture here of a home health device where you could potentially do this in a remote assessment, either patient themselves or having it with a remote home visit. And then, you know, the case of medical imaging, obviously you can't have someone do an X-ray or a CT scan at home, but you can do something in a remote setting where you might have an imaging facility that was properly trained performing those assessments if you can't get into the clinic. Next slide. Communication procedures are something we spend a lot of time on. One of the points of guidance from the FDA is to avoid mixing methods, though. If you're going to use telephone or video, try and stick with one, because the variation could be introduced. Screen sharing may be important too, to look at when you're looking at the assessments, their questionnaires, to be able to make sure that the information is captured correctly with the patient. We've already talked about the privacy, making sure we confirm and ensure that on both sides. Identity verification. It's put to the sponsors of studies to figure out how they want to properly identify the parties' identities on both sides. But you can imagine tools where you might show through a video conference, maybe some kind of photo identification. And then we already mentioned training. It's an area that we're spending a lot of time on. And as mentioned previously, it's applying the technology to those subjects who may not have it. And a special note here on training, I know that especially given elderly subjects, there's been recent publication in JAMA about up to maybe probably over a third of those over the age of 65 are not adequately equipped from a training and technology standpoint to do these kind of assessments, and there needs to be a way to get them properly trained and equipped. Next slide. There's also some things in terms of updating the protocols that are mentioned in the regulations, and communicating with the regulators. They're mentioned many times, and all the guidance is if you have a question, you please bring it to the FDA and ask about the suitability and their opinions. They may not have the answers, but they'll give at least the best guidance that we know, and what are the plans for training and for providing technology. But also keeping the protocol, if there is changes that the Institutional Review Board or IRB needs to be updated, and so you may have to update patient consent as well. And I put on a form consent here the use of e-consent tools. I know the FDA has opened up their electronic application for use in the interim for looking at e-consent, but there's also provisions for mail or even electronic document exchange, and possibly even a verbal consent with a witness attestation, but you need to have follow-up documentation as well. Whatever the process, it needs to be documented and it needs to be defined and it needs to be rolled out in a consistent way. Next slide. And ultimately, what we're looking at here is, well, what are we going to do? Because we're making some changes mid-study, and will that have an effect on our statistical analysis? Up front, it needs to be considered. Methods for handling of missing data. What if we just can't get the data? We need to carefully document if the visits were done in a different way, if they were done virtually or by remote visit or in the clinic, and look at if that had an effect potentially on the results. And we have to be open to the need to maybe compare the data across the different modes, and might have to account for the additional variability by recruiting extra patients. There may be the need to do that. Compliance may be impacted, so we may not be getting the same amount of information. So unfortunately, we're going to have to be prepared to address these things and be prepared up front before database lock to adequately account for these variations in procedures and adjust for them if necessary. Next slide. So I want to thank you for your time and for the extra few minutes that I needed. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly. I'm not sure if we have time for questions and answers, but I turn it over now to the moderator.
Thanks very much, Ken. Jonathan Seltzer here from CSRC. I want to thank all the speakers, for the regulatory speakers, for giving us their thoughts on how they're thinking and how we need to structure our trials with respect to cardiac safety, and to the folks from industry for demonstrating what real-world data kind of looks like and some of the difficulties and nuances in obtaining it. It's clearly a very complex area. We don't have time for questions today. If you have any suggestions or questions, please contact us at info@cardiac-safety.org. There'll be further communications on this from the CSRC, and I think that many of the issues raised today, of course, we'll get the guidance from FDA on decentralized clinical trials, but they certainly, at least in the world of cardiac safety and cardiac endpoint monitoring, there's a need for definition and communication of best practices when you're combining remote visits within clinical trials. And hopefully that will be an area that you'll join us in the future as CSRC tackles that in a future program. So with that, I'll turn that back to Sarah, and thank you all for attending.
Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers today, and for you, Dr. Seltzer, for moderating our event. And thank you for everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for today's event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers today. We hope you all found this conference to be informative. Have a great day, everyone.